October 1820, St. Helena. A short man stands at a window. He has 6 months left to live. The doctor is sharpening an instrument. The medicine beside the bed was not made in France. October 4, 1820. Longwood House, St. Helena in the South Atlantic. The hour is just before dawn. Napoleon Bonaparte is standing at the window of his bedroom in a white dressing gown and slippers. The shutter is half open. The trade wind is coming in over the lava plain. He is 51 years old. He has lost about 14 kilograms in the last 18 months. A small mahogany table sits beside the bed. On the table is a bottle of antimony tartrate prepared 3 days earlier by his Corsican physician. Beside the bottle is a folded sheet of paper. The paper is the second draft of his last will. He is looking east toward the line where the sky meets the ocean. He stands there for 14 minutes without moving. This is the last 10 years of Napoleon Bonaparte. The decade from March 1811 to May 1821 was the decade in which the largest land empire of modern Europe collapsed, and one man followed it down. It was the decade of Russia, Leipzig, Fontainebleau, Elba, Waterloo, and St. Helena. It was the decade of one body finishing its work in front of 7 witnesses who all kept written records. 4 forces closed in on him across those 10 years. The first was the army. The Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River in June 1812 with about 615,000 men. Fewer than 110,000 came back. The second was the Empire. By April 1814, he had lost every territory annexed to France since 1797. The third was the family. His second wife, Marie-Louise, had taken another partner by 1814 and never visited him in exile. His son was raised in Vienna under another name. The fourth was the body. The same disease that had killed his father at 38 was already growing inside him. We know what happened inside the house at Longwood because the men around him kept records. His secretary Emmanuel de las Cases wrote down everything between January and November 1816. His Irish physician Barry O'Meara kept a journal until 1818. His Grand Marshal Henry Gaston Bertrand kept the Cahiers de Sainte-Hélène almost daily until the death. His valet Louis Marchand wrote a long memoir. His last physician, François Antimarchi, signed the autopsy. 3 open questions sit at the center of this decade. Why did he keep marching east after Smolensk in August 1812? Why did he leave Elba 10 months after arriving? And why, in the spring of 1821, did he ask for a priest he had not asked for in the previous 5 years? The final decade begins here. The body that crossed the Niemen in 1812 was not the body that had crossed the Alps in 1810. Napoleon was 42 years old in June 1812. He weighed about 90 kilograms. His personal physician, Dr. Jean-Nicolas Corvisart, had been treating him since 1804 for hemorrhoids, dysuria, that is, painful urination, and what Corvisart called stomach attacks, episodes of cramping pain that came after meals. The Russian campaign accelerated everything. At Borodino on September 7, 1812, his aides recorded that he had a heavy cold and stayed seated through most of the battle. At Vilna in December, he was suffering from frostbite of the hands and nose. By the time he returned to Paris on December 18, 1812, his secretary Mayneville recorded that he had aged 10 years in 6 months. Through 1813 and 1814, the symptoms widened. The German campaign saw him fall asleep on horseback during the Battle of Dresden. At Leipzig, on October 18, 1813, his coachman Caulaincourt found him asleep at his desk at 3 in the morning, holding a quill in his hand. On the night of April 12 to 13, 1814, after his abdication at Fontainebleau, he swallowed a sachet of opium, belladonna, and white hellebore. He had carried the sachet around his neck since the Russian retreat. Caulaincourt and Constant, his valet, found him at 2 in the morning vomiting violently. The poison had aged in 2 years and lost most of its strength. He survived. He never spoke of the attempt. On Elba, between May 1814 and February 1815, the British observer Sir Neil Campbell described him as physically vigorous. He rode, he swam, he reorganized the local roads, and he gained back about 6 kilograms. After Waterloo and the surrender to HMS Bellerophon on July 15, 1815, the decline restarted. Aboard HMS Northumberland on the 10-week voyage to St. Helena, the ship's surgeon William Worden recorded chronic constipation, swollen ankles, and intermittent fever. At Longwood, between 1816 and 1820, the symptoms hardened into a pattern. He spent hours each day in a hot bath, sometimes 6 hours at a time. The bath was filled and refilled by the Chinese laborers attached to the household. His doctor wrote it down, first Omira, then briefly Stocco, and from September 1819 the Corsican Antimarchi. By the autumn of 1820, the pattern named itself. He vomited a black liquid that Antimarchi described as resembling coffee grounds. In modern medicine, that finding has a name: hematemesis, from a bleeding upper gastrointestinal lesion. He had pain after meals that radiated to the back. He could not lie flat without discomfort. His father, Carlo Buonaparte, had died of a stomach cancer in 1785 at the age of 38. His sister Pauline would die of a stomach cancer in 1825 at 44. His brother Lucian would die of a stomach disease in 1840. By March 17, 1821, he could no longer leave the bed. By April 15, he was dictating the corrections to his will. By May 3, he was no longer fully conscious. He died at 5:49 p.m. local time on May 5, 1821. The autopsy on May 6 was performed by Antimarchi and 7 British surgeons. They found a perforated cancerous lesion in the stomach measuring approximately 3 inches across, with adhesion to the underside of the liver. The cause of death was recorded in writing on the same sheet in the presence of all 8 physicians. The mind that crossed the Niemen in 1812 was not the mind that had crossed the Alps in 1800. The pattern through the decade was not a single decline, but an oscillation between long stretches of intense work and shorter stretches of motionless silence. Caulaincourt shared a sledge with him during the long return from Russia in December 1812 and kept a near-verbatim record of the conversation across 13 days. In the sledge, Napoleon talked for hours about Caesar, about the difficulty of reaching India, about whether the burning of Moscow had been ordered by the governor Rostopchin or by drunken stragglers. Then he would stop and sit motionless for an hour. Through 1813, the pattern intensified. His private secretary Maineville recorded that he dictated state papers for 14 hours at a stretch in February, then refused to leave his cabinet for 3 days in March. His brother-in-law Murat wrote to his wife Caroline that the emperor's eyes were now fixed in a way he had never seen before. Publicly, he said one thing; privately, he wrote another. In the bulletins from Dresden and Leipzig in 1813, the army was always advancing, always victorious, always within reach of a final stroke. In the private letters to Marie-Louise from the same dates, he asked her 3 times to send a small portrait of the King of Rome, and once asked her whether she still loved him. After the abdication and the suicide attempt of April 1814, the men around him recorded a flat affect that lasted into the Elba period. On Elba, his moods recovered with activity. He inspected his small army. He drained marshes. He dictated proclamations about silkworm cultivation and road maintenance. Sir Neil Campbell, the British Observer, wrote home that the emperor seemed more cheerful than I had expected to find him. The 100 days reactivated the older pattern. Marshal Soult, his chief of staff, wrote in 1816 that the emperor on the morning of June 18, 1815 was not the man of Austerlitz. On St. Helena, the oscillation became the daily structure of the household. Las Cases recorded that on certain mornings the emperor would dictate without pause from 7 until 11, then refuse to speak again until evening. Bertrand's cahier, kept in cipher and not deciphered until 1949 by Paul Fleuriet de Langle, recorded a stranger pattern. From 1818 onward, Napoleon began to discuss religion at length with Bertrand and Montholin. He had long described himself as an unbeliever in personal terms, but a believer in the social usefulness of the Catholic Church. From 1818, the conversation shifted. He asked Bertrand whether the soul could survive the body. He asked Montholin whether the priests at his mother's house in Rome would say Mass for him after his death. Marchand, his valet, recorded in his memoirs the long silences of 1820. The emperor would sit at the window for an hour at a time, looking east, saying nothing. A modern reader of these records can see 2 patterns at once. One is the slow withdrawal of a man whose stomach was bleeding into itself for years before anyone could name what was happening. The other is the deliberate construction of a public account by a mind that was already shaping the verdict it would receive after death. Three external forces compressed the decade. Each had its own clock. Each ended one of the open questions planted in Beat 2. The continental system was the trade blockade against Britain that Napoleon had imposed across Europe in 1806 and 1807. By 1810, it was failing. British goods were entering Europe through smuggling networks in Amsterdam, Hamburg, and the Baltic ports. Russian grain and naval stores were leaving for British buyers in defiance of the system. In December 1810, Tsar Alexander I formally withdrew Russia from the system by ukase. He raised tariffs on French luxury goods and opened Russian ports to neutral shipping that was, in practice, British shipping under flags of convenience. Napoleon had two answers. He could accept the failure and renegotiate Tilsit, or he could enforce the system by occupation. He chose enforcement. Through 1811, the Grand Armée was assembled in Poland. By June 1812, it numbered about 615,000 men from 20 different national contingents. The army crossed the Niemen on June 24, 1812. By August 17, it stood in front of the burned town of Smolensk. Caulaincourt, Berthier, and Murat all advised wintering there. The Russian armies of Barclay and Bagration were retreating without giving battle. He listened. He walked to a window. He gave the order to keep moving toward Moscow. Borodino was fought on September 7. He entered Moscow on September 14. The fire began that night. He stayed 35 days waiting for a peace offer that never arrived. The retreat began on October 19. Fewer than 110,000 men recrossed the Niemen under arms. That was the week everything changed. He marched because he had decided the continental system could not survive a public failure. The army that came back from Russia could not defend Germany. Through 1813, the Sixth Coalition assembled Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, Britain. At Leipzig, October 16 to 19, 1813, three Allied armies met one French army across 4 days. About 600,000 men were engaged. French casualties exceeded 70,000. Leipzig opened the road to France. The 1814 campaign, fought with armies of teenagers and old men, included 6 small French victories in 9 days in February. None of them mattered. By March 31, the Allies were in Paris. Marshal Marmont surrendered the city without orders. The Senate, led by Talleyrand, declared Napoleon deposed on April 2. On April 4, his marshals confronted him at Fontainebleau. Nay, MacDonald, Lefebvre, and Oudinot told him the army would not march on Paris. He abdicated conditionally in favor of his son. The Allies refused. On April 6, he abdicated unconditionally. The Treaty of Fontainebleau, signed April 11, 1814, gave him sovereignty over Elba and an annual income of 2 million francs from the restored Bourbon government. The Bourbons never paid it. By autumn 1814, he was using his own savings to maintain the household and the small garrison. In February 1815, he left Elba. He landed at Gulf Juan on March 1 and reached Paris on March 20 without firing a shot. The 100 Days ended at Waterloo on June 18, 1815. He surrendered to Captain Maitland of HMS Bellerophon on July 15, arrived at St. Helena on October 15. He left Elba because the income was not paid. Sir Hudson Lowe took up the governorship of St. Helena on April 14, 1816. His instructions from Lord Bathurst were specific. The prisoner was to be addressed as General Bonaparte. No correspondence could leave uncensored, no visitors without authorization. The household budget was capped at £8,000 per year. Napoleon refused to be addressed as General Bonaparte. He refused to receive Lowe except in formal audiences. After August 18, 1816, the two men never met again, although they remained on the same island for 4 years and 7 months. The friction absorbed an enormous share of the household's attention. Bertrand's cahiers record dozens of disputes over small sums, over sentry placement, over the censoring of newspapers. Napoleon used the friction as evidence in the memorial of British vindictiveness. Lowe used the same friction as evidence to London that the prisoner remained dangerous. Inside Longwood, the household compressed. Las Cases was expelled in November 1816 for attempting to send an uncensored letter. O'Meara was removed in July 1818. Gurgaud left voluntarily in March 1818 after a quarrel with Muntholin. By 1820, the household had shrunk to Bertrand and his wife Fanny, Muntholin, the valet Marchand, the cook Piran, and the Corsican physician Antimarchi. Inside that smaller household, the work of the memorial and the campaign histories continued. The book, when published in 1823, would shape French politics for the next century. The single decision of the decade was made in the burned town of Smolensk on August 17, 1812, between approximately 3 and 6 in the afternoon. The town was a ruin. The Russian Second Army of Bagration had pulled out the night before, setting fire to the wooden quarter as it left. The brick walls of the old Kremlin still stood, most of the rest was ash. Napoleon had set up his headquarters in a stone merchant's house on the western edge of the town. The room had a single tall window looking east. 3 options sat on the table. The first was the one urged by Caulaincourt, his master of the horse, and Berthier, his chief of staff. Winter at Smolensk. Fortify the supply line. Send foraging parties south into the Ukrainian grain regions before the Russian autumn closed the roads. Resume the campaign in May 1813. The argument was logistical. The Grande Armée had already lost about 150,000 men to disease, desertion, and combat in 2 months. The horses were dying. The second was the one urged by Marshal Murat and a smaller group of cavalry generals. Pursue Barclay's First Army northward toward St. Petersburg, force a battle by threatening the capital. The third was the one Napoleon chose. Pursue the combined Russian armies eastward toward Moscow. Moscow was the city of Russian identity. Its loss, he believed, would make further resistance impossible. The argument lasted approximately 3 hours. Caulaincourt, in his memoirs dictated in 1822, recorded the substance. Napoleon walked back and forth in front of the window. He listened. He asked specific questions about the supply situation. He looked at maps. He stopped at the window twice and looked east. At approximately 6 in the afternoon, he turned from the window and gave the order. The army would advance on Moscow in the morning. Caulaincourt recorded the moment in 3 sentences. He had decided. He looked tired. He did not look uncertain. The decision committed the Grande Armée to a winter campaign in a country where it had no shelter, no forage, and a supply line that ran 900 kilometers back to the Niemen. It committed Napoleon personally to a public outcome, the capture of Moscow, that he privately knew might not produce the political collapse he was banking on. Borodino was fought on September 7. About 250,000 men engaged. Combined casualties exceeded 70,000 in one day. The Russians withdrew during the night. The road to Moscow was open. Moscow was entered on September 14. Rostopchin's police had begun setting fires the same day. By September 18, the fire had consumed about 3/4 of the wooden city. Napoleon stayed in Moscow for 35 days. He sent 3 separate letters offering negotiations to Tsar Alexander. None received a reply. On October 19, he ordered the retreat. The army left Moscow with about 100,000 effectives. Fewer than 25,000 crossed the Niemen under arms in December. Other detachments brought the total of returning men to about 110,000 out of 615,000. Every event of the next 9 years followed from that afternoon at the window. The German campaign of 1813, Leipzig, the abdication at Fontainebleau, the suicide attempt with the aged poison, the exile to Elba, the 100 Days, Waterloo, the surrender on the Bellerophon, the 6 years at Longwood. The dictation of the memorial, the long death from the stomach disease his father had also died from, all of it begins on the road his army took out of Smolensk on the morning of August 18, 1812. Caulaincourt would later write that the emperor seemed to know by the time the sledge reached Vilna in December that the campaign had ended something larger than itself. He talked about it for 13 days in the sledge. Then he stopped. He never publicly admitted the decision had been a mistake. In private, in the conversations Bertrand recorded at Longwood in 1819 and 1820, he returned to it. He returned to Smolensk 3 times. Each time he gave Bertrand a slightly different reason. Each time he ended the conversation by walking to the window and looking east. He never fully recovered from that night. May 5, 1821, Longwood House. The hour is shortly before 6 in the evening. Napoleon Bonaparte is in a small camp bed in the drawing room. The bed has been moved there because he can no longer climb the stairs to the bedroom. He weighs about 60 kilograms. The shutters are open. The trade wind is coming in over the lava plain. Henry Gaston Bertrand is on his right. Charles Tristan de Montholon is on his left. The Corsican physician Antimarchi is at the foot of the bed. The valet Marchand is by the door. The Abbé Vignali, the priest who arrived in 1819, is in the hall. At 5:49 p.m. he stops breathing. Bertrand writes the time down. Marchand stops the clock on the mantelpiece. The room is silent for 14 minutes before anyone leaves. He died at 51 of a stomach disease his father had died of at 38, on an island 5,000 kilometers from the city in which his son was being raised under another name. That was the final decade of Napoleon Bonaparte, the last 10 years of a man who shaped the world. And this is what they actually looked like from the records that survived. If you want to see what power actually costs, subscribe. Every week, one more final decade. Next week, a taller man, a Washington theater box, a Dr. 5 rows back in the audience, a bullet still in its chamber. Disclaimer: every claim in this video is sourced to a documented historical record. No speculation, no invented quotes. Terminal Decade is an analytical history project.